The room had gone quiet in the way rooms only go quiet when something has already gone too far. Sarah Calloway, 34 years old, sat at the far end of the conference table in a cream blazer she had ironed herself that morning, her aluminum cane leaning against the armrest beside her. She had not been invited to this meeting. She had come anyway, and now 41 floors above downtown Atlanta, with floor-to-ceiling glass casting long afternoon shadows across the mahogany table, her husband of 6 years stood at the head of the room with a glass of sparkling water in his hand, staring at her like she was a stain on an otherwise clean suit. Dominic Calloway, 38, co-founder of Voss Calloway Development Group, did not raise his voice. He never needed to. The way he looked at her was enough. "Sarah," he said her name the way you say the name of someone who has wandered into the wrong building. "This is a closed session." She did not flinch. She did not look away. She set her portfolio flat on the table and folded her hands on top of it. And she said, quietly, "I know." Before we go any further, if this is your first time on this channel, welcome. We tell stories here that are grounded, real, and the kind that make you sit up straighter in your seat. If that's what you're here for, hit subscribe right now, tap that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one. Now, let's go back to that conference room. Because what you just saw was not the beginning. It was the surface. Underneath it, something had been building for 2 years, patient, quiet, and devastating. Sarah had not always needed the cane. 18 months earlier, she had been the kind of woman who moved through a room and changed its temperature. She was a brand strategist, the kind companies paid significant money to tell them who they were and what they should say. She had built her first client portfolio at 26, launched her own consultancy at 29, and by 32, she had a reputation in Southeast regional markets that Dominic had privately leveraged more than once when trying to open doors with developers who wouldn't return his calls. Then the accident happened. A rain-slicked highway, a truck that drifted lanes at 60 miles per hour, and a spinal contusion that the neurosurgeon described as incomplete, meaning she kept most of her mobility, but not without cost. There were mornings when the nerve pain was a 6 and evenings when it climbed to a 9. There were days she needed the chair, more days she could manage with the cane. And there were moments, still, when she moved through a room like she used to, and you could almost forget anything had changed. Dominic had not forgotten. He had simply chosen to use it. It started small, the way these things always do. A comment at a dinner party in Buckhead, 6 weeks after she came home from the hospital. She had been slow getting up from the table, and Dominic had said to the couple across from them, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes, "She moves like a 90-year-old. I keep telling her she needs to pick up the pace." The other couple had laughed, uncertain, the way people laugh when they don't know if something is a joke. Sarah had smiled. She had been very good at smiling then. By the time she was 8 months into recovery, the comments had become a pattern. At his company's holiday function, he told a group of investors she parked in the handicapped spot even on her good days, just in case. At her own cousin's wedding, when she struggled briefly on uneven ground outside the venue, he leaned toward a colleague and said loudly enough for the row behind them to hear, "I keep waiting for her to fall. Honestly, at some point it might just be easier." Not a single word was shouted. Not one was violent. They were surgical, those words. They were designed to diminish, and they worked in the specific way that only slow, repetitive cruelty works, by making the person on the receiving end begin to believe that the observation was simply accurate, that she was less than she had been, that she was, in some unspoken contractual sense, no longer the version of herself he had agreed to. What Dominic did not know, what he had never bothered to know, was that Sarah had kept records, not out of premeditation, not at first. She had started writing things down the way many people in pain do, in a private journal, a notes application on her phone, a habit carried over from therapy. Dates, words, settings. But somewhere around month 10, the habit had shifted into something more purposeful. She started including names. Who was present? Whether anyone had heard. Whether anyone had reacted. She had written 342 entries by the time she walked into that conference room, and she had shown every one of them to Nadia Osei. Nadia was 41, a corporate attorney who had known Sarah since their early 20s when they had briefly shared an office sublease in Midtown. She was not a warm person in the way that the word warm is usually meant. She did not bring casseroles or leave encouraging voicemails. But she was precise. She was a woman who read contracts the way a surgeon read film scans, and she had the specific gift of seeing the thing that mattered buried inside the thing that looked like it mattered. When Sarah first called her, 8 months into the marriage's quiet deterioration, Nadia had listened without interrupting for 22 minutes. Then she had said, "Send me everything." Sarah had. And then Nadia had asked the question that changed everything. "Sarah, who owns your consultancy?" The answer was, Sarah did. Or rather, an LLC she had formed at 29 under her maiden name. Sarah Marchetti still owned it. When she had married Dominic, she had updated her personal accounts, her licenses, her professional profiles, but the LLC itself, Marchetti Brand Group, had never been formally restructured. More importantly, one of the assets under that LLC was a proprietary brand framework she had developed over 3 years, a systematic methodology for repositioning mid-market real estate developers that she had branded internally as the Meridian Method. She had licensed it to 4 clients. One of those clients was Voss Callaway Development Group. The license had been drafted in 2019, before the marriage, and it had been quietly renewed once since. It contained a standard clause. In the event of termination by either party, a 60-day wind-down period was required. But beneath that clause, buried in the addendum that had been standard issued by Nadia's office at the time, was a secondary provision. If the licensor could demonstrate that the licensee had materially benefited from the framework within the preceding 24 months, meaning that the brand positioning, client-facing language, or investor presentations had drawn directly from Meridian Method materials, the licensor retained the right to seek equity compensation in lieu of royalties. Dominic had never read the addendum. His in-house counsel at the time had been a junior associate who flagged the main body and moved on. The deal was not large enough to warrant the scrutiny they were used to applying to 8-figure transactions. It was a licensing fee for a consultant's proprietary framework, $40,000 annually, renewed by email. Except that Dominic had, in the 24 months since the renewal, used the Meridian Method in his pitch deck for the Hartwell Commons development, a mixed-use residential project that had attracted $12.4 million in outside investment. The investor presentations, the brand positioning language, the phased rollout framework that had convinced Fletcher Mace, a private equity partner based in Charlotte, to commit $4 million of those dollars. All of it carried the Meridian Method's architecture, translated into Dominic's slide deck without attribution, without renegotiation, without so much as an acknowledgement. And Fletcher Mace was scheduled to sign the final partnership agreement in 2 weeks. This is the part of the story where most people think Sarah was just waiting to get angry. She wasn't. She was waiting to be ready. There is a difference, and it matters enormously to how this ends. She had spent the 3 months prior to that conference room meeting doing something Dominic would never have thought her capable of. Nothing. She had attended his events. She had smiled at his colleagues. She had absorbed 2 more of his comments. One at a firm luncheon where he told a junior architect that she couldn't walk in a straight line on a good day, let alone think in one. And the other at a Friday dinner with his mother, where he gestured toward her cane with a kind of exaggerated pity that made his mother shift uncomfortably in her chair. She had absorbed these moments like sediment, settling quiet and still to the bottom while the water above kept moving. Because Nadia had told her, the timing had to be precise. The Hartwell Commons closing had to be close enough that unwinding it would cause Dominic maximum exposure, but not so close that he had already transferred the capital. The window, Nadia said, was specific. 2 weeks out, once the investor documents were circulated but before the notarization. That was the moment. The license termination letter had already been drafted. It cited the equity compensation provision. It attached 14 exhibits, all pulled from Dominic's own publicly filed investor documents, his firm's website copy, and a marketing video posted to the Voss Callaway YouTube channel that had used the Meridian Method's 6-stage positioning language verbatim, in the exact sequence Sarah had documented in her original 2018 workbooks. The letter demanded not a cash settlement, but a 22% equity stake in the Hartwell Commons project, valued, at current projections, at approximately $2.7 million. Alternatively, the licensor reserved the right to notify all relevant parties of the unlicensed usage prior to closing, which would almost certainly cause Fletcher Mace to pause, trigger his due diligence clause, and potentially walk from the deal entirely. The letter was certified, dated, and ready to be sent. All it needed was Sarah's signature. She had not yet signed it. Because something had changed in the week before the conference meeting, and Sarah needed to understand it before she made the final move. Dominic had, for the first time in months, been different toward her. Quieter, not kind. He was not a man built for softness, but restrained in a way that felt calculated rather than changed. He had held the car door for her twice. He had not made a single comment at his partner's birthday dinner. And 2 days before the meeting, he had placed a single document on the kitchen counter and left it there without saying a word. She had read the first page and then set it face down. It was a petition for dissolution of marriage, already signed by him. No note, no conversation, just the document, sitting on the counter next to the fruit bowl, as though it were a utility bill. She understood then that he had heard something. That word had leaked, or he had found something. One of Nadia's preliminary inquiries, perhaps, or a name he had seen in a filing. He did not know the specifics, she was sure of that. If he had known the specifics, the divorce petition would not have been left quietly on a kitchen counter. It would have been served by a process server at 8 in the morning. The counter move meant he was trying to preempt something he could not yet see clearly. He wanted the marriage dissolved before whatever was coming could complicate his asset picture. She picked up her cane, picked up her portfolio, and drove herself to his office. If you're still following this closely, and I think you are, type the word Meridian in the comments right now. Let's see who's truly paying attention, because the best part of this story hasn't happened yet, and I promise you, what comes next is the reason people share stories like this. Back in the conference room, the silence had stretched long enough that Dominic's business partner, a man named Garrett who had always been diplomatically neutral around Sarah, looked down at the table. 3 junior associates sat against the far wall, not sure where to look. The presentation on the screen behind Dominic, preliminary slides for the Hartwell Commons closing strategy, sat frozen on slide 4. Dominic set down his glass. Sarah, we're in the middle of something important. I know, she said again. She opened her portfolio. She removed a single envelope and slid it down the table toward him. It stopped within arm's reach. So am I. He did not pick it up immediately. He looked at it the way you look at something you recognize without wanting to. Then he looked at her. What is this? Open it when you're ready. She closed her portfolio, placed both hands on the armrests, and stood carefully, the way she had taught herself to stand over 18 months of recovery, slowly, deliberately, with complete control. She lifted her cane. I'll see myself out. She did not rush. She moved through that conference room at her own pace, and no one said a word, and she felt their eyes on her the entire way to the door, and she did not look back once. Nadia was waiting in the lobby downstairs. She was standing by the elevator bank with 2 cups of coffee, and when Sarah stepped out of the elevator, Nadia handed her 1 cup without a word, and they walked out into the Atlanta afternoon together. Did he open it? Nadia asked. Not yet. He will in about 6 minutes. Then he'll call his attorney. I know. His attorney is going to tell him the addendum is enforceable. Sarah took a slow sip of coffee. I know that too. What followed was not dramatic in the way that people expect these things to be dramatic. There was no screaming phone call, no desperate appearance at her apartment. She had moved into a furnished sublet 3 weeks earlier, quietly, with a single bag and her laptop. Dominic was not the kind of man who showed desperation in public. He was the kind of man who called in favors, got his people in a room, and tried to solve problems from behind closed doors. That was exactly what he did. His attorney contacted Nadia within 2 hours. The call was professional, measured, the kind of conversation two lawyers have when they both understand the terrain. Dominic's position, his attorney explained, was that the Meridian method materials used in the Hartwell Commons presentations had been substantially modified and therefore did not constitute licensable usage under the original agreement. It was a thin argument, and everyone on that call knew it. Nadia replied that she was prepared to provide a side-by-side comparative analysis to any arbitrator or judge who wished to examine it, along with testimony from the original framework's creation, which included timestamped files going back to 2016. She further noted that the equity compensation demand remained the preferred resolution, but that notification to the investing parties remained an available alternative. The call ended. 20 minutes later, Dominic's attorney called back and asked if there was any flexibility on the 22% figure. Nadia looked across the desk at Sarah, who was reading something on her phone with the quiet focus of someone who had already made up her mind. Sarah held up 2 fingers without looking up. 20% is our floor, Nadia said into the phone. Not a point below. There was a pause. I'll relay that. Please do. Nadia paused deliberately before adding, the closing is in 11 days. We'd encourage a resolution before then. The negotiation lasted 4 days. Not because the legal ground was uncertain. It wasn't, and Dominic's team knew it. But because Dominic himself resisted the reality of it. He was not a man accustomed to having the floor removed from beneath him, and the particular quality of this situation, that it was Sarah who had done it. Sarah with her cane and her 300 journals and her old LLC that nobody had thought to look at, seemed to operate in him like something he could not metabolize. At one point, his attorney conveyed that Dominic wanted a direct conversation. Sarah declined. There was nothing to say that the documents hadn't already said more clearly. What Dominic had not anticipated, what perhaps no one had anticipated except Nadia, was that Fletcher Mace had his own attorneys reviewing the closing documents during this same window, and Fletcher Mace's team, as part of standard due diligence, had requested a full IP clearance summary from Voss Callaway. This was routine, but under routine review, the Meridian method license surfaced. And when Mace's attorney ran the name Marchetti Brand Group and found an active licensing dispute attached to it, he flagged it immediately. Fletcher Mace called Dominic directly on a Thursday afternoon. Sarah was not on that call. She did not need to be. Nadia had a contact at the Mace Group who described it simply. Mace was not angry. He was something worse. He was careful. He told Dominic that he admired what the Hartwell Commons project represented, but that he needed the IP situation resolved and documented before he could proceed to notarization. If that took longer than the current closing window, he would need to reassess his calendar and potentially push to the following quarter. The following quarter was not acceptable to Dominic. His construction financing had a commitment expiration date. Pushing the equity closing by a quarter would trigger a renegotiation of terms with his lender, terms that had become less favorable in the past several months as the rate environment shifted. The numbers changed significantly. The project, as structured, relied on this precise closing window. Nadia called Dominic's attorney that evening at 5:47 and said simply, "We're prepared to execute documentation and provide a clean IP clearance letter within 48 hours. Our terms remain 20% equity in the Hartwell Commons entity, transferred to Marchetti Brand Group, LLC, with full clean documentation for the Mace Group's review." The attorney said he would call in the morning. He called at 7:15. Mr. Calloway has agreed to the terms. The signing happened on a Tuesday in a law office on Peachtree Street, with none of the drama of a confrontation and all of the weight of one. Dominic sat across a table from Sarah for the first time since the conference room, separated by a surface covered in documents, with their respective attorneys on each side and a notary at the head of the table. He did not look at her when she came in. He looked at the documents. He signed where he was told to sign. His jaw was set, and his hands were still, and he looked exactly like a man who had decided that composure was the only thing he had left to manage. When it was done, he stood, buttoned his jacket, and said nothing to her. He said something quietly to his attorney, and they walked out together. The notary gathered the documents. Nadia put her pen away and exhaled slowly. Sarah sat still for a moment longer. She was looking at the window. Outside, Atlanta was bright and ordinary. Traffic moved. A delivery truck double-parked on the corner. A woman in a red coat walked quickly past with a phone to her ear. Sarah picked up her cane and stood. There was, of course, more that came after. The divorce proceedings moved forward. Dominic had filed first, which actually complicated his own position, since the Marchetti Brand Group equity transfer had been completed before the dissolution was finalized, meaning it was not a marital asset subject to equitable distribution. Nadia had seen to that timing with characteristic precision. The dissolution itself was not contested. There was nothing left to contest that was worth the cost of contesting it. Dominic retained the development firm, the properties, the Hartwell Commons project, which did close, eventually, with Mace's capital intact, and with Marchetti Brand Group listed quietly as a 20% equity partner. Fletcher Mace, for his part, had asked no further questions. He was a businessman. The IP clearance was clean. The documents were in order. He moved forward. What followed in the months after was the kind of aftermath that doesn't make headlines, but that changes the texture of a person's daily life permanently. People in Dominic's circle, slowly and then quickly, began to understand what had happened. Not from any announcement or public statement. Sarah made none. But in the Atlanta development community, people talk, and attorneys talk through their talking, and within 6 weeks the rough shape of the story was understood by anyone who cared to ask. That Sarah Calloway had walked into her husband's conference room with a cane and a single envelope, and had quietly dismantled 6 years of dismissal without raising her voice. That the methodology his firm had built a $12 million project around had belonged to her the entire time. That he had mocked her in front of his colleagues for 18 months while sitting on her intellectual property. Garrett, his business partner, called Sarah once. Not to discuss business. He called to apologize, not for anything he had done specifically, but for what he had watched and stayed silent about. It was an uncomfortable call for both of them. She thanked him for making it. She did not say more than that. The 342 journal entries, by the way, were never filed in any court proceeding. Nadia had kept them as contingency, in the event that Dominic contested the dissolution on any grounds that required evidence of his conduct. He did not contest it. The journal entries remained in a password-protected file on Sarah's laptop, which she eventually moved to an external drive and put in a drawer. She did not read them again. There was no need. She relocated that autumn, not dramatically, not to another city or another coast, but to a different neighborhood, a quieter street, a first-floor apartment with wide doorways and a small courtyard where she worked most mornings when the weather allowed. She kept the consultancy. She took on 2 new clients that fall, both referrals, both mid-market developers who had heard her name through channels she did not entirely trace. She hired a part-time assistant. She bought new furniture, not as a statement, but because the old furniture had been chosen with someone else's taste in mind, and she wanted a table she had picked herself. The nerve pain did not go away. It did not get significantly worse, either. Some mornings were still 6s. Some were 3s. She had learned, with the patience of someone who has spent 1.5 years negotiating with her own body, that the scale was not fixed, and that the days were not predetermined, and that the fact of the cane did not say anything certain about any particular morning until that morning arrived. She had stopped explaining this to people who asked. She had started simply letting them observe it. The people worth keeping in her life noticed the difference and adjusted accordingly. The others did not stay long. Nadia came for dinner once a month, usually on a Friday, and they talked about work and occasionally about the past. And sometimes they did not talk much at all, and simply sat in the courtyard with wine and the particular comfort of two people who have been through something together and do not need to describe it to each other anymore. There is a version of this story where the ending is a scoreboard, dollar figures, equity percentages, legal wins tallied like points. That version is accurate, but incomplete. The truer ending is this: that a woman spent 2 years being made to feel smaller in increments so subtle she almost believed them herself, and then she stopped believing them, and then she did the work, quietly, legally, with documentation and a trusted ally and a piece of paper that nobody had bothered to read, and she reclaimed the space that had always been hers. Not all at once, not loudly, in the only way that actually holds, through precision, patience, and an unwillingness to shrink any further. Dominic Calloway moved through the next year the way men like him often do after a loss they cannot publicly acknowledge, forward-facing, outwardly composed, grinding toward the next project. Whether he understood what he had actually lost, not the equity stake, not the IP leverage, but something more fundamental about what he had underestimated and why, was not something Sarah spent time wondering about. She had spent enough months looking in his direction. She was done. On a Wednesday morning in November, 7 months after the signing, Sarah sat in her courtyard with her coffee and her laptop, and her cane resting against the table beside her. The air was cooler now, the light thinner. A neighbor's dog barked twice and went quiet. She opened her email and found a message from a new prospective client, a development group out of Nashville, referred by someone she hadn't spoken to in 2 years, asking if she had availability for a discovery call. She read the email once, closed her laptop, and sat in the morning for a few minutes longer. Then she opened it again, and she wrote back, "If you made it to the end of this story, and I know not everyone does, you deserve to know that it was worth your time, because this is exactly the kind of story this channel was built for. Before you go, do 3 things for me. First, subscribe if you haven't already, because there are more stories just like this one waiting. Second, hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it genuinely helps more people find these videos. And third, and this is the one I care about most, drop a comment below and tell me which moment in this story hit you the hardest. Was it the conference room? The envelope? The journal entries? The morning she wrote back? I want to know, because that's where the real conversation starts. I'll see you in the next one.